Perfect Dark, released in 1999, continued Rare's stride of Nintendo 64 hits. The shooter sold well and quickly solidified itself as a fan favourite. Rare would later revisit the IP in a prequel initially set for the GameCube. After they were famously acquired by Microsoft, the project moved over to the Xbox before finally migrating to the Xbox 360 as a launch title in the form of Perfect Dark Zero. The game garnered reasonably positive reviews from critics when it was first released, but as time went on, appreciation for it diminished. Its reception among fans wasn't nearly as warm as the originals, and even some of the publications that did take a liking to it remarked of how it failed to meet the high standards left behind by its predecessor. More crucially, there were some inside Rare itself who weren't happy with it. If Perfect Dark as a series was to continue, it was looking increasingly likely that it would do so with an approach very different from the one adopted by Zero. This was further cemented when Chris Tilston, its director, decided to work on an MMO game named Cascade after it was finished. With Tilston occupied, the company's managers Chris and Tim Stamper then pursued other options in order for them to keep developing Perfect Dark games on the Xbox 360. Their candidate to pick up the reins was Chris Seaver, the writer and director of Conker's Bad Fur Day. When they first approached him in late 2006, he was already deep into developing another game concept, an adventure title known as Urchin. Chris, however, soon accepted their offer of leading a new Perfect Dark while Urchin was shelved. Seaver then began to develop ideas for this next game and was given a team of around 12 people to help bring them to life. His new take on Perfect Dark was very much a reaction to what he perceived were the mistakes of the previous games. It was his attempt to reform the series and its title character, moving it into a place that was previously unexplored territory, but where he felt it always should have gone to. Stepping back from the mythical melodramatics of Zero's story, this new game was shaping up to be a more serious romp with its roots firmly in science fiction. Like every Perfect Dark, the portrayal of its protagonist, Joanna Dark, was a reflection of the tone the game was striving to convey and differed accordingly. This Joanna was much less of the sensitive young girl seen in Zero or the light-hearted heroine of the original. We would have seen a very different interpretation of the character. She was tougher, colder, a killer hardened by her years of experience. The Jo in this game has been through a lot in the time since she was last seen, and she's carrying the scars both physical and emotional as proof of that. She now walks the line between trained assassin and psychopath. Over the course of development, documents were put together plotting out every beat of the campaign. This included a list of chapters, levels, and even the colour palette each location would use. Seaver imagined its story in what was, for a pitch of this nature, fairly great detail. It was shaping up to be an intricately woven plot intended to have players constantly second-guessing. It was filled with elaborate twists such as surprise betrayals and major revelations about the Perfect Dark universe. Unlike Zero, this new installment was a sequel to the Nintendo 64 game taking place years after it. It brought back some familiar narrative elements, including extraterrestrials like the Skedar. It would have seen Jo embarking on an adventure around the world and beyond it as she unravels another alien conspiracy. She first visits the tombs of Cairo before heading to Russia and eventually into outer space. She would have been joined by a team of allies that grows throughout the game as you progress. Most of these were new characters with one exception. Their names were Milton, Pennington, Mia, and Sable. Eventually they would be accompanied by Elvis, the main alien who Joanna befriended in the first game. Chris revealed that Elvis would not have remained friendly, however, he would have betrayed them as the game went on. In the backdrop of all this, humanity in the Perfect Dark universe has advanced to the point where manned space travel further across our solar system has become a reality. Russia is in the process of investigating the area of space around Saturn, and Ms. Dark, curious about their intentions, isn't far behind. She's also facing a mysterious new foe, Prince Vox, the game's central antagonist. Later into the story, she uncovers that the Russians have found evidence of possible alien activity on one of Saturn's moons, Titan. Scientists examining it may have found proof of an ancient civilization beneath its icy surface. After being briefly imprisoned in a gulag, Jo escapes and with the aid of her team moves to infiltrate a planned Russian expedition to Titan. They secretly stow away aboard shuttles which take them to a small space station in Titan's orbit called OSV Huygens. This was a reference to Christian Huygens, the real-life Dutch scientist who discovered Titan. From this point, Jo and her team descend to the surface and eventually navigate their way below it to see for themselves the apparent remnants of this ancient civilization. realization, as they come to understand all is not as it seems, or as Chris Seaver himself put it, Titan hides a terrible secret. Titan, in the Perfect Dark universe, is in actuality Earth from the future. It transpires that around 50 years in the future from Joanna's present, the end of the world arrives when aliens attack using advanced black hole technology. The planet is catapulted through space and time itself. It's sent back billions of years into the past to a time when Saturn was closer to the sun. Earth is pulled into its orbit before freezing over into its final resting place. That's not the only big reveal that would have come to light in the game's final act. Players would have learned that Prince Vox, the aforementioned villain, is in fact a much older version of Joe Dark from the relatively far-off future, in disguise. Following these revelations, Joanna would have returned to the surface for the final stage. It's around this point that yet another twist plays out, and one of her teammates, Mia, unmasks herself as Mr. Blonde, one of the evil Skedar warriors from the first game. Mr. Blonde's fate was left ambiguous after the events of Perfect Dark, and he now reveals himself as being among the last surviving members of the Skedar race, back to claim his revenge. Joanna's remaining teammates are killed, and she herself is left critically injured. In the closing cinematic, Mr. Blonde leaves using a Mayan spacecraft, abandoning Jo on Titan's surface to her presumed death. The last shot sees her looking out at the moon's barren landscape, with Saturn visible in the distance. "Nice view," she remarks. This, however, wasn't the absolute end. Chris Seaver and his team proposed doing not just one game, but two of them. The first was dubbed Perfect Dark Core, and its direct follow-up was named Perfect Dark Vengeance. It was a 2-episode sci-fi epic, one overarching narrative taking place over 2 releases, and each part was planned to be developed back to back. Chris compared this process to the multi-part approach adopted by certain Hollywood films, like the Harry Potter and Hunger Games movies respectively. Part of the team's motivation behind wanting to do this was to alleviate downtime between projects. With the technology from Core already built, and everything mapped out moving forward, they would have been allowed to develop Vengeance with greater efficiency. They hoped to create 2 fully featured games that could stand on their own terms, both with, for example, a multiplayer suite on top of the campaign mode. It was never precisely determined how exactly they intended to explain Jo surviving the events of Core's ending, but one former designer did recall discussions of potentially using advanced technology like teleportation as a means of reversing her presumed death. Regardless, Seaver himself suggested that her revival might well have been in vain, and that her subsequent efforts to undo Earth's doom would have in reality done more to cause it, a tragic self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. The developer teased however exactly it was going to play out that it wouldn't have ended well for Perfect Dark. Beginning with Perfect Dark Core, there were aspirations of making an FPS campaign that would defy the norm at the time, moving against the design principles adopted by shooters like Call of Duty. Chris wanted to apply a less linear sandbox feel that would give players more control and make battles seem much more dynamic as opposed to scripted. A designer who worked on the project shared some of the concepts that were prototyped during development that exemplify these philosophies. One feature worthy of note were unscripted physics-based interactions with your environment. You could kick doors open, and if timed correctly, they would smash enemies in the face, leaving them stunned. Players would have been able to rack up combos by landing hits in quick succession, and if a certain amount was reached, a deadly Bond-esque finishing move would become available. In Perfect Dark Core, getting through levels solely through use of firearms was generally discouraged. You would have often been pushed towards finding more intuitive ways to resolve combat situations, like shooting out supports to cause a heavy object to fall and crush enemies. Using stealth was also an option. Another big addition to the formula was a mech that Joanna would have been able to pilot. During certain sections, a dropship would become available within standard gameplay, which players could use to summon a large and powerful mech to assist you in battle. Jo could hop in and control it, or remain on foot and direct it remotely, assigning it basic commands like follow or attack. The mech had been given the nickname Talbot by members of the team, which appears on its model. This was a very deliberate nod towards Gary Talbot, an animator who worked on the project. Initially, when Joanna first encountered the Talbot mech, it would have appeared hostile, but once defeated, it would become a reliable tool in her arsenal. There were other gadgets being tested too, including grenades that would slow down time within the vicinity of detonation. The player's perspective in Core was being described as ultra first person, introducing parkour style movement, expanded melee combat, and a new camera system to create a much more intense, visceral experience. When this was initially pitched to Rare's management, there were some concerns that this might cause motion sickness, so a lot of time was spent fine-tuning and balancing it, giving realistic weight and inertia to head movement. Joanna's head would even turn automatically in reaction to external stimuli like explosions within a certain distance of her. Despite the game being worked on for around a year, Joanna herself was never actually given her own in-game model. As director, Chris was never sufficiently satisfied with any of the design concepts suggested by Rare's artists. Instead of committing to one as the basis for a model, a placeholder was used for prototypes, another model that had already been made from male AI soldier. Perfect Dark Core was under development between 2006 and 7 among an increasingly small team. It had not at any point been approved for full production. They were given the freedom to experiment and build their ideas to hopefully secure the green light from Microsoft. Former employees admitted that in the latter half of its lifespan, the core team had become desperately understaffed. First, artists were removed, causing the team to shift towards concentrating on developing an engine and other tech, as well as polishing Joanna's movement. Eventually, the team was reduced to no more than several people. Shrinking their resources like this was a deliberate attempt by Rare to keep the project low cost and under Microsoft's radar to prevent them from intervening and cancelling it. Rare's management had faith in the project to produce a worthwhile sequel, and months were spent trying to convince Microsoft of its potential. It would ultimately come down to a meeting in 2007 between members of Rare and Microsoft Game Studios to determine its fate. On Rare's side, this included founders Chris and Tim Stamper alongside project leader Chris Seaver. They were joined by Microsoft's Ken Lobb, Shane Kim, Phil Spencer, and their corporate vice president of interactive entertainment, Peter Moore. What apparently ensued was a lengthy back and forth of Rare trying to persuade the publisher of its creative merits to have them funded as one of their next big games. Microsoft's representatives weren't convinced. They made the argument that the Xbox 360's first party lineup already had multiple titles belonging to the sci-fi shooter genre. From their point of view, with popular franchises like Halo and Gears of War, this was a pillar they had already covered thoroughly. Rare's heads insisted that Perfect Dark could still offer an experience unique and interesting enough to stand out from those games, but ultimately it wasn't enough. Microsoft's people were unable to overcome their reservations and cited underwhelming sales figures for Perfect Dark Zero as another reason why it was a risk. It was Peter Moore who would have the final say, who turned down the proposal then and there. Perfect Dark Core and its imagined sequel Vengeance would not come to be. For Rare, it wasn't a complete loss, however. Some of the technology developed during Core was harvested to be used in other projects, namely Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. After it fell through, the remaining few members of the Perfect Dark team drew up two new concepts to rework some of their ideas. The first was a short-lived multiplayer co-op game with a Looney Tunes-esque cartoony aesthetic and exaggerated physics. Then there was Ordinary Joe, Chris Seaver's take on the survival horror genre. This saw them re-implementing the parkour and climbing mechanics that were originally programmed for Core. It would have tasked the player, who was unarmed throughout the game, with scaling rooftops to escape an evil force invading from a parallel world. Both of these projects, like Perfect Dark's lost sequels, were never picked up. Chris Seaver, as well as all of the most central members of his Perfect Dark team, later left the company in the years that followed. If you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe. You can check out many more unreleased games just like this one over on my channel, including an exclusive look at a Guitar Hero MMO. Or you can stick around here to see the video game based around Dirty Harry, which would have starred Clint Eastwood and a whole host of other famous actors. You can visit Unseen64 at Unseen64.net. The site is an archive for cancelled, unreleased and beta games. I've been Liam, I hope this video has been of interest, and have fun.